Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this subject and review this video that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video by the boxing channel known as Johnboxing P4P the Best. And I like to review his channel every once in a while, just like I like to review a certain amount of channels because, once again, not only will this be an opportunity to give my perspective, but also their perspective as well. And oftentimes, once again, like I said, what you'll find out the majority of the time, not just within but the sport of boxing, but many sports in general, and just many things in general, most people, they don't really come from a logical standpoint. They come from a very political or fanboyish point of view. And after Naoya Inoue had fought the other day, I thought that it was a perfect time to do this little video because I noticed that a certain amount of the LDBC and new media channels, or at least some of these fans, whether they be Terence Crawford fans or Gervonta Tank Davis fans or Jerron Boots Ennis fans, they take a look at it and they say, well, Naoya Inoue is a little bit overrated in terms of his ranking because he doesn't, and I believe that I had one comment in my comment section that stated that he said that Naoya Inoue doesn't really deserve the ranking that he has to be top 3 or top 4 pound for pound because he's fighting a lot of these bums at the lower weight classes that really are not that particularly talented or guys that really just are not that particularly good. And what I'll say about Mr. Naoya Inoue is this. I don't think that he has a quote-unquote A plus or S tier level resume. I would tend to agree with that. But how people forget, how soon people forget that Terence Bud Crawford was in a very similar situation to Naoya Inoue just a few years ago before he was fighting guys like Sean Showtime Porter and that of Errol Spence Jr. And I see a certain amount of these guys in the comment section. They compare Inoue and Crawford and Gervonta Tank Davis and Jerron Boots Ennis, and I see certain people, once again, they want to label certain elite fighters elite or very talented when they've not accomplished anything in the sport. And then when it comes to other fighters, they want to claim that, they're very talented or all this other stuff. So people pretty much pull that narrative out of their ass and they never keep the same standards according to what argument they want to make according to their favorite fighter or a fighter that they believe that they need to tear down. But like I stated, and this is all based off of what Canelo Alvarez stated the other day about Terence Bud Crawford. And Canelo Alvarez, what he stated about Terence Bud Crawford the other day is that although Terence Bud Crawford is a great fighter, it's no disrespect to him. He's only really ever fought one great fighter in his career. I've fought multiple. And what I'll personally state is this. I'm not going to state that Terence Bud Crawford has only ever fought one great fighter or one A grade level name. I think that Terence Bud Crawford has about 5 A grade level wins in his career. Like I stated, he has Israel Madrimov or Israel Madrimov, however you want to pronounce it. And even that is a little bit of a debate because we don't really know how good Madrimov actually is. He's never defeated anybody really in his career. So we're going to have to see how he is against Virgil Ortiz. But then, of course, you also have Errol Spence Jr. That, of course, is a confirmed A plus level win. Of course, you have Sean Porter. That, in my view, is around an A minus level win. And then, of course, you have Victor Polstall, which is about an A minus level win, and your Yurkus Gamboa, which is around, A minus to A grade, because Gamboa really wasn't supposed to be at that weight class in the first place. But once again, Canelo Alvarez stated this, and of course, Mr. Johnboxing P4P the Best, he had his thoughts on it. And I'm going to kind of once again be talking about the career of Canelo Alvarez and Crawford and Inoue, once again, as it goes along. But once again, for a certain amount of the people that were in my comment section saying that Naoya Inoue, that he doesn't really deserve to be top 3 or top 4 pound for pound because he's not really facing anybody, but then certain people love to criticize Gervonta Tank Davis's resume. Well, listen, Gervonta Tank Davis has fought a very talented A-grade level fighter in both Frank Martin and Ryan Garcia, but here's the problem. Naoya Inoue has the one fight in his career against Steve Von Fulton that would have a bigger impact than any of the fights in Gervonta Tank Davis's career. And I know that a certain amount of people are not going to like that, but listen, Steve Von Fulton was looked at the time as a top 20 pound per pound level fighter. That's what he was looked at. And a lot of those same people that claim that Fulton can't punch and that he can't do this, a lot of those same people claim that Steve Von Fulton was going to embarrass Naoya Inoue heading into that fight. Not stating that those are the same people that were in my comment section necessarily, but a certain amount of people had Steve Von Fulton beating that of Naoya Inoue. That was looked at as a 50-50 level fight heading into that fight, and Inoue moved up in weight to pretty much whoop Steve Von Fulton's ass. When you talk about Gervonta Tank Davis, I understand that the Ryan Garcia win is a very impactful win, but Ryan Garcia, if we're just going to be real, he was looked at, although is very physically talented, in terms of the skill set, he left a lot to be desired. People pretty much came into that fight knowing that Ryan Garcia, that the only chance that he was really going to have over Gervonta Tank Davis was to knock him out. He wasn't really going to be able to beat him in any other way. He closes his eyes when he throws punches. He turns his back completely in a 90-degree angle, or not even in a 90-degree angle, like literally like a 180. Like, I don't know what the fuck he does. He closes his eyes when he throws punches. He doesn't work off the jab particularly well. His chin is wide up in the air, you know, and on top of that, he's never even been a legit champion before. The best win that he had on his resume before then was against Javier Fortuna, you know, so it just is what it is. Now, of course, he eventually was able to beat Devin Haney. Keep in mind that, of course, that win is overturned, so I'm not even sure if we can count that anymore, but I understand what people are trying to state, you know. But then after that, of course, he beat Frank Martin, who was a relatively good A-grade level fighter, but he also was never a champion. So once again, people can, you know, say that all they want to, but at the end of the day, although I would agree that Inoue does not have an A-plus level resume on average, Terence Bud Crawford was doing the same shit just a few years ago. He was beating a lot of bums at the 140 and at the 147-pound weight class. A lot of people that people had either A, never heard of, or that no one had ever really wanted to see him fight. Like Jose Benavidez or Aegis Velasquez or, you know, Felix Diaz and, you know, the Crawford fanboys. They always love to spin it in the best way possible. But the truth of the matter is that there's a reason why no one talks about those opponents. Because no one sees those opponents as A-grade level wins, period. But it is what it is. But anyways, we're also going to talk about Canelo's resume, also compared to Inoue, also compared to Crawford, and maybe mix in Usyk as well. But let's get into it. Let's see what the man has to say.
If you ask me, I think Terence Crawford has a pretty solid resume. I don't know what Canelo Alvarez is talking about. You know,
if you're just asking my personal opinion on Terence Bud Crawford's resume, this is just my personal view. I think that he has a good resume, but do I think that it's anywhere near on the level of a Canelo or a Mayweather or a Pacquiao? Not necessarily stating that I think that Canelo's resume is quite on the level of a Manny Pacquiao or a Mayweather, because you're talking about two of the greatest resumes of all time. You're talking about Pacquiao that has wins over Barrera and Morales and Cotto and Timothy Bradley and other guys that would have been on the top 10 pound per pound list, possibly mentioning some other guys, you know, Keith Thurman. And then, of course, when you talk about Mayweather, you know, he beat several fighters that at the time would have been top 10 pound per pound. Like when he beat Shane Mosley. Shane Mosley had returned to the top 10 pound per pound list after he had whooped the shit out of Antonio Margarito. He beat Marquez and Pacquiao when they were both top 10 pound per pound. He also beat Diego Corrales and Ricky Hatton when they were top 10 pound per pound. And there might be one or two other fighters on the top 10 pound per pound list that I personally forget that maybe Floyd fought. Of course, he also beat Canelo when Canelo was looked at as just on the top 10 pound per pound list. So Canelo may not quite have a resume on the level of Mayweather or Pacquiao. Not quite. But it's about a level, you know, below their resumes. Crawford's resume is about a few levels below their resumes. Terence Bud Crawford, once again, his career is very similar to that of a Joe Calzaghe. Great fighter and extremely dominant, but when you take a look at a lot of the wins in his career, a lot of people are going to take a look at his record and say, who the fuck is that guy? Like, who the fuck are these guys that he's fought? You know, once again, so it just is what it is.
Spence is not the only solid name on Terence Crawford's resume.
Now, you notice immediately, not to interrupt it here too much, you know, once again, for those of you that really either, you know, pay attention to certain social cues or certain, you know, patterns that people say, once again, I've always been a person that's been relatively good at reading people, and when someone even believes in something or when they don't. The reason why he said that Errol Spence is not the only solid name on his resume, and the reason why he used solid instead of elite or instead of great, is because he realizes that Terence Bud Crawford doesn't have the best of resumes. That the only actual great fighter that you could actually debate was on his resume was Errol Spence Jr. That's the only one. Now, when you talk about all the other fighters, that's great, but Gamboa, we don't really know how great he actually was because he never really beat anybody in his career other than Orlando Salido. That was probably the biggest one in his career. Then he moved up to 135, never really belonged there in the first place. And on top of that, Gamboa was an extremely flawed fighter. But if you take a look at Crawford versus Gamboa, it was very obvious that Gamboa never belonged to that weight class in the first place. So it is what it is. And you take a look at the next win, Victor Postal, once again, great win. But, you know, once again, I'm going to let this guy talk about it because we're going to go through the wins individually.
I think people don't really acknowledge Terence Crawford's resume due to the lack of promotion that Terence Crawford had the majority of his career.
No, and that's not the reason why. The reason why Terence Bud Crawford's resume doesn't get talked about is because he fought a lot of bums. It is what it is. The same way that certain, some fans are talking about Inoue's resume is the same way that people were talking about Terence Bud Crawford's resume, and rightfully so. Right now, just how Inoue is not facing a whole lot of clear A grade level names, like TJ Doheny and this Kim guy, and even Louis Neri. I mean, he's debatably A grade, but I wouldn't say that it's a for sure. The same way that Inoue is fighting some of these guys, but certain people would debate that he's number one pound for pound because he's the most dominant fighter in the world and looks like the most skilled fighter in the world. Terence Crawford was in that exact same situation. So whenever you have these Aki TV guys or some of these guys saying that, oh, Crawford, he really was the number one pound for pound, but he never got put there because they didn't want a black fighter to be the number one pound for pound guy in the sport. Well, if you're going off of those standards, okay, well then you need to scream at the mountaintops about how Inoue is getting shortchanged as being the number one pound for pound fighter in Ring Magazine and some of these other lists, even ESPN, because he's Asian or because he's Japanese or because he's in overall one of these lower weight classes. Because that narrative that you just put about Crawford makes just as much sense as overall me saying that about Misonoya Inoue, even though Inoue is ranked within the top 3 or top 4 on every list. He's never number 1 on any particular list, but apparently Naoya Inoue is ranked way too high. Well, if you personally believe that, that's up to you, but then you should also hold the same belief that Crawford overall never was truly the number 1 pound for pound fighter until Errol Spence. But you have a lot of these guys that claim that Crawford, oh, he really was there. They just didn't want him there because he was a black fighter. Listen, are there certain examples to where black fighters are mistreated or they have double standards? Absolutely. But a lot of people, and this is why Aki TV and Dante, I like to review their videos, they cause so much spread of idiocy and so much fake news when it comes down to that. Once again, I like to review their videos because they spread so much bullshit. Once again, their narratives will make you believe that Crawford was not there because he was a black fighter. No, Crawford was not there because he was fighting a lot of bums. That's why.
Terence Crawford is just now becoming a star after he departed with Top Rank. Isn't that crazy? No one's really having a conversation about it. Terence Crawford did his best work when he was signed with Top Rank, but it was never acknowledged due to the lack of...
He did his best work, but the reason, once again, why it wasn't acknowledged is because, no offense, 90% of those fighters were bums. It just is what it is. Like I said, no one cares that you beat Felix Diaz. No one cares that you beat Aegis Velasquez or Joyce Ndango. No one cares. None of those guys are A-grade level fighters, period.
Emotions that he had while he was signed with Top Rank. Bob Arum did not care about Terence Crawford. And so, because of the lack of promotion, no one really actually sees what Terence Crawford has done throughout his career. And it's to the point where fighters like Yorkis Gamboa gets overlooked. Victor Postol, the undefeated Victor Postol, gets overlooked. You see, Victor Postol was the fighter who knocked out Lucas Matiste, the Machine. This is the fighter that a lot of people claim that Danny Garcia ducked.
Right, but people act like Lucas Matisse was like this A-plus level fighter. Lucas Matisse had multiple losses in his career. Not to say that he didn't get better after some of those losses, but it's not like it's not like this dude was just completely impossible to beat. And on top of that, Victor Postol was like, what, 5'11" for that weight class with the 70-something inch reach. Lucas Matisse was about 5'6", with the 60-something inch arm reach. Victor Postol ended up beating him, and a big part of the reason why is because he was so much lengthier and taller than him. He ended up beating and knocking out Lucas Matisse, but Victor Postol was not this A-plus level fighter. And there's a reason why after he lost to Terence Bud Crawford, he ended up getting pretty much beat in every big fight that ever mattered after his career as well, or after the Crawford fight as well. Now, certain people may say, well, he was never personally the same after the Crawford fight. Well, you can make that case if you want to, but it's not like Victor Postol was knocked out or anything. He was just completely outperformed.
Crawford, it's crazy how he's not getting any recognition for beating someone like a Victor Postol in the way that he did it. A lot of people, they look at the stars of the sport and automatically think that they are the best fighters. And then when it comes to the fighters that are not the stars, they usually get overlooked because they're not stars. You see, Victor Postol is not a star.
Well, this is the thing I'm going to mention about Victor Postol really quickly. Because as we all know about Victor Postol, he's from the Ukraine. But the thing that I always hear about Canelo Alvarez whenever he beats someone like a Billy Joe Saunders or a Callum Smith or a Caleb Plant is that, well, those guys are weak European white boys. So Canelo shouldn't get much credit over those guys. And then when Naoya Inoue beats guys like Jamie McDonald or certain guys like that, well, those guys apparently are bums. So why is Victor Postal not looked at as a bum when he fights someone like that of a Terence Crawford? Because it's not like Lucas Matisse was someone that was invincible. He lost to Danny Garcia, and Danny Garcia was a decently great fighter, but he's a guy that was around an A- level fighter. But it's not like Lucas Matisse beat both Amir Khan and Danny Garcia within that weight class. It's not like he beat the two best 140 pounders in the world. He was a very good fighter, but he was around an A- level fighter. It just is what it is. Matisse was a relatively great fighter, but he was not someone that was invincible. He just wasn't, So once again, he did beat Lucas Matisse, but then after that, the clear level in skill showed against Crawford, and it is what it is. Once again, you have a certain amount of these guys that claim that Saunders and Smith and Plant, that they were quote unquote bums and these weak white boys against Canelo Alvarez. Let me ask you something. Is Victor Postal more talented than a Caleb Plant or a Billy Joe Saunders or a Callum Smith? Because in my view, he's not. What makes Victor Postal more talented than those guys? He's certainly not more talented than Plant or Billy Joe Saunders. I don't even think that he's more talented than a Callum Smith. And Callum Smith does have a little bit of that stiff European, Caucasian, British style, I understand. But at the end of the day, Callum Smith was a dude that had whopping power in both hands, and he had relative boxing talent. It's so interesting. They always talk about Canelo that, he fought Saunders and Plant who didn't have that much power. Victor Postal was not known for a great amount of power. He doesn't even have a 50% knockout ratio. He knocked out a Lucas Matisse who was a decent amount, smaller than him in terms of height and reach. That was a big part of the reason why he won that fight. But then when it come to the fights against Jose Ramirez, Josh Taylor, Gary Antoine Russell later on, he lost all of them. He lost all of them. Period.
Yorkis Gamboa is not a star, but they are world-class fighters. You see what I'm saying? And these are the fighters that Terence Crawford has beaten. The only star that Terence Crawford did beat was Errol Spence Jr. But see, Errol Spence Jr., he was a star right alongside with him being a great fighter. Okay, but it's not to say that the fighters that are not the stars were not great fighters. The fighters that Crawford fought and beaten that were not stars were actually really, really good fighters. I like to go back to that Jeff Horn fight, which is a fight that a lot of people didn't forgot about. You see, there's a story behind the Jeff Horn fight. Now, I know some people are going to come at me.
Yes, there is a story behind the Jeff Horn fight, and it's very simple. What the Crawford fans will love to do is that they'll love to say this stuff about how Jeff Horn, how he was this guy that was one of the best welterweights in the world. Well, he ended up becoming a champion because he had a very tough and close fight with Manny Pacquiao that a lot of people thought that he lost, by the way. But, yeah, it was a very close fight. I actually did not mind Jeff Horn getting the decision because I think Manny Pacquiao headed into that fight and heavily underestimated him. But people try to act like Jeff Horn was this elite level welterweight. No, he wasn't. Jeff Horn was a guy that beat Manny Pacquiao, a fight that he never should have won in the first place. Probably a Manny Pacquiao that heavily underestimated him, and also one that was a bit older and kind of trailing, along at that point in time in his career. And then Jeff Horn, he faced up against Terence Crawford, someone that took him very seriously, got his ass kicked, stopped, and we never heard from him again. What Jeff Horn is he's one of these fighters, and every generation has one or two of these guys, or a few of these guys. They end up winning a belt over a very great fighter or over a decent fighter, but they never really deserved that belt in the first place. They either won that belt because the fighter was a bit older or because that fighter heavily underestimated them or something of a sort. We've seen this on multiple occasions. We've seen it with Buster Douglas against Mike Tyson. He never really was supposed to beat Mike Tyson in the first place, but because Mike Tyson was more focusing on fucking every girl in Japan overall more than actually practicing, and then on top of that, Mike Tyson, you heavily underestimated him. He ended up getting stopped within that fight. But then you never heard of Buster Douglas ever again after that fight. Now, to be fair, he had actual good talent, but he just never had the discipline. That's why in the Evander Holyfield fight, you could tell he was majorly overweight. He had man tits and he had a belly in the Evander Holyfield fight because after that, he let his lack of discipline get to him again. It just is what it is. We've seen it with Muhammad Ali against Leon Spinks. Leon Spinks was never an elite level fighter. His ending career record, I believe, was like 26-17. But he ended up getting Muhammad Ali when he was a bit older and someone who probably had underestimated him, someone that he probably thought was going to be easy because he was only 8-0 at the time. So we've seen it with that. We also seen it a little bit with Teofimo Lopez and Kambosos because Kambosos never ended up winning another belt after that. Now, Kambosos, in my view, is more talented than someone like a Jeff Horn, and he's probably around an A- level fighter. But he went into the fight with Teofimo Lopez actually expecting to win. And on top of that, he was the perfect type of style to counter Teofimo Lopez. But is he a guy that's going to beat any of the A-grade level fighters around his weight class? Is he going to beat Lomachenko or possibly Teofimo in a rematch? Probably not. Is he going to beat Devin Haney? Is he going to beat, Shakur Stevenson or Keyshawn David? No, he's not going to beat any of those guys. That's why I say every generation has one of these stories. A fighter that ends up winning a belt, when they probably shouldn't have, and then you never hear shit from them again. Jeff Horn was one of those fighters.
Say, well, Jeff Horn was a bum. Now he's a bum. But before he fought Crawford, he was not a bum because of his victory.
Jeff Horn was a B or C grade level fighter. Stop bullshitting. Jeff Horn was nothing more than a B or C grade level fighter. Let's stop.
Over Manny Pacquiao. Say what you want about that fight. You can make the excuse that Manny Pacquiao was being cheated because of Jeff Horn's dirty tactics. You can say that Manny Pacquiao was robbed against Jeff Horn. But the point is, that fight had no business being close in the first place. Manny
Pacquiao, by the way, for those of you that don't know, was about 38 years old when he fought that fight. But isn't it so interesting how these guys, when it comes to Canelo or certain guys that, they need to tear down, they say that, oh, well, he beat him way past their prime. So is Manny Pacquiao not way past his prime at around 37, 38 years old? Isn't that very interesting? He won't bring that up?
Yeah, was far too good to even being in a competitive matchup with someone.
Now, of course, taking a look at it from a logical angle, Manny Pacquiao was still at a very great point in his career at that time. He was looking a little bit older at that time. And then, of course, within the next couple of years, he'd look a little bit better. He would beat guys like Jesse Vargas, Adrian Broner, and, of course, Keith one-time Thurman, guys who were either champions at that time or had been former champions. But I would not really consider Adrian Broner nor Jesse Vargas as A-grade level opponents. I would consider them as B-grade level opponents, because no one's ever going to take a look at those guys and actually assume that they're going to beat any A-grade level fighter.
Like Jeff Horn, Manny Pacquiao should have beaten the brakes off of Jeff Horn the way that Crawford did. But Jeff Horn won that fight, and that's how he got a fight with Terence Crawford. So you guys can dismiss Jeff Horn all you want, but the story behind the Jeff Horn fight...
Well, if we're counting Jeff Horn as an A-grade level fighter, then we need to start counting guys that Canelo Alvarez fought, like a Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and and certain guys overall in his career that are more B-grade level. We need to consider them as big wins as well. So then that means that Canelo Alvarez's resume is even greater overall once again than what it was originally before. Because I'm sorry, but Jeff Horn is not no A-grade level fighter. Just stop. And listen, I always use this standard when you talk about these fighters. Jeff Horn, for example, or the majority of the opponents in Terence Bud Crawford's career. Do you believe that they would even beat someone like an Adrian Broner? Do we really believe that the majority of the opponents that Crawford fought at 140 would beat Adrian Broner? Do we really believe that the majority of the opponents that he fought at 147 would beat Adrian Broner, barring, of course, Errol Spence Jr. and Sean Porter? Do we really believe that they would beat Adrian Broner? Do we believe that if a peak version of both Ricky Burns and Adrian Broner, if they had fought, and if they had been the same size, that Adrian Broner loses that fight? No, probably not. And Adrian Broner, we know that he's not an A-grade level fighter because he's not ever able to beat an A-grade level fighter. He loses dominantly in every single A-grade fight in his career. So the thing is, once again, if they can't even get past someone like an Adrian Broner, really ask yourself, do you believe, let's just go through the whole list. Do you believe that Ricky Burns beats Adrian Broner? No, I don't. Do I believe that Raimundo Beltran beats Adrian Broner? No. Do I believe that moving up that Thomas Delorme beats Adrian Broner? No. Do I believe that Hank Lundy beats Adrian Broner? No. Do I believe that Felix Diaz beats Adrian Broner? No. Do I believe that Julius Ndango beats Adrian Broner? No. Do I believe that Victor Postal beats Adrian Broner? Maybe. You can maybe debate that, but I would say that Victor Postal, in my view, is probably around the same level as a Jesse Vargas. And Jesse Vargas was able to get a draw against Adrian Broner. So, I mean, that's up to you. Gamboa, if they were the same size, yeah, I'd give Gamboa that fight. So I consider that as an A-grade level win. But let's go up to the welterweight class. If Jeff Horn and Adrian Broner are the same size, does Adrian Broner lose that fight? No. If Aegis Kavalauskas and Adrian Broner are the same size, does Adrian Broner lose that fight? No. If he ends up facing Jose Benavidez, does he lose that fight? No. If he ends up facing David Avanesian, does he lose that fight? No. So that's why I say, that's the way that I judge it. And if they were to face Danny Garcia, someone that's an A- level fighter, someone that's one level above Adrian Broner, they would pretty much, all those fighters that I just mentioned, they pretty much would get knocked out by Danny Garcia. That's how you can tell, once again, who's an A-grade level fighter or not. And if in your mind, none of those fighters will beat Adrian Broner, then guess what? They're not A-grade level wins, period.
Was Jeff Horn coming into the Crawford fight with a win over Manny Pacquiao?
Now, of course, people may say, well, you're also missing Kell Brook and Amir Khan. Right. At that point in time, they were completely washed. Like the way that people talk about Canelo Alvarez's resume, always facing guys out of their prime. Terence Bud Crawford fought Kell Brook and Amir Khan when they were done. Amir Khan was done. After he got knocked out by Canelo Alvarez, he had nothing left. He then had 1 or 2 fights after that. He had a fight against a C-grade level fighter in Samuel Vargas. Got knocked down once or twice within that fight. Looked awful. And then would go on to fight Terence Bud Crawford. Kell Brook, after he got knocked out by both Golovkin and Spence, was never the same fighter again after that. He looked awful at a few fights at 154. Then Kell Brook had to come back down to 147. Hadn't fought there in years, and then got knocked out by Crawford. He was completely washed. Those are examples of washed fighters.
Yeah. Okay? And Crawford destroyed that dude. Destroyed him. I mean, it wasn't even a competitive matchup. And we're talking about a Crawford that was making his debut at the welterweight division against a guy who's coming off of a win over Manny Pacquiao. Okay? And so I don't know what Canelo Alvarez is thinking by, his statements about Terence Crawford's resume, because
very easy. He's thinking with a little bit of logic and rationale, something that you apparently don't have.
He doesn't really have a pot to piss in himself. The majority of the world-class fighters.
No, actually, he does have a pot to piss in. And not only does he have a pot, he has a pool to piss in. Canelo Alvarez, his resume is much greater than Terence Bud Crawford's. I don't care what anybody says. No one cares. Like I said, the majority of those fighters that had fought Terence Bud Crawford, they don't beat someone like an Adrian Broner. Now, if we take a look at Canelo Alvarez's resume, for example, and if we say, let's compare it to Adrian Broner if they were within the same weight class. We know for sure that Adrian Broner doesn't beat guys like Golovkin nor Erisani Lara. We know for sure that that doesn't happen. He probably doesn't beat a Caleb Plant. He probably doesn't beat a Jamel Charlo. He probably does not beat a Danny Jacobs or someone like that, or an Austin Trout at his absolute peak. He definitely probably does not beat someone like a Miguel Cotto, although Cotto, of course, was clearly smaller than Canelo. But even Sergey the Crusher Kovalev at that point in time in his career, you put someone like a Adrian Broner and a Sergey the Crusher Kovalev within the same weight class, more than likely, Sergey Kovalev's going to come out on top. Even Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, and someone like a Caleb Plant, they all probably would be a little bit better than someone like a Adrian Broner, for example. So it is what it is. Once again, you take a look at Terence Bud Crawford's resume, the majority of those guys are B-grade level fighters. I'm sorry, it just is what it is.
Fighters that Canelo Alvarez is beating, meaning the fighters that had name recognition, they were either old or on their ways out the sport.
No, that's not true. But once again, that's another one of the pro-black cult narratives that they try to use about Canelo Alvarez. Listen, if you want to state that in the Miguel Cotto fight, that Miguel Cotto was older and that he probably would not have not been at his absolute peak, that's fair. But to state that he was just completely washed up, that's not true, because he had became a champion. Miguel Cotto once again became the Ring Magazine and the WBC middleweight champion, off defeating Sergio Martinez. Now, Martinez, of course, was done. He was washed up, but Miguel Cotto had taken a new career path, and he was looking pretty decent. Not against anyone that was really A-grade at that point in time, but he did have a renaissance kind of at that point in time in his career, and a resurgence. He was knocking out Delvin Rodriguez, who previously gave Austin Trout a tough fight. He knocked him out within 3 rounds. And then, of course, overall later on, he would go on to beat Daniel Gill and certain guys at the middleweight division. No one that I would really consider super A-grade, but Cotto looked like he was a little bit refurbished. And, of course, him and Canelo had a relatively good fight. So Cotto was still A-grade. It's just that he wasn't at the best point in his career. But that Miguel Cotto win that Canelo Alvarez got, it's around, in my view, it's as comparable as when Crawford beat Gamboa, in my personal view. And Cotto, even at that point in time in his career, is more skilled than someone like what a Yuriorkis Gamboa ever was. Someone who keeps his hands down way too often, gets a little bit too wild and crazy, and someone who's also very chinny. And that's not me trying once again to discredit Crawford's win over Gamboa. That's just saying comparatively, I would even put Miguel Cotto's win that Canelo has over Cotto slightly above the Gamboa win. But, I mean, that's debatable. They're maybe within the same room.
And the fighters that did have name recognition, they were not old. Canelo Alvarez never fought them.
Right, so Canelo Alvarez never fought guys like Austin Trout, Erisani Lara, Gennady Golovkin. He never fought Danny Jacobs. He never fought Caleb Plant or Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith, Jaime Munguia. He never fought any of those guys. Now, the 2 guys that he's probably talking about is Jamal Charlo versus Andrade. Canelo had sent apparently an offer to Jamal Charlo many years ago, and Jamal Charlo had turned it down. So that's Jamal Charlo's problem. And then recently, Canelo Alvarez had tried to make the fight as well, and Jamal Charlo ended up turning it down. That's why Canelo had to fight his, smaller brother, and that of Jamal Charlo, because Jamal Charlo said that he wasn't ready. So it is what it is. Now, Demetrius Andrade, that was a fight that Canelo was never interested in because overall, once again, I think that he thought that Andrade was a little bit too much of risk for the potential reward. So that's the one fight that I'll say that at least around those weight classes that Canelo definitely, either A, tried to not take or definitely tried to get away from. But Jamal Charlo, no. He tried to make the Jamal Charlo fight once or twice, and Jamal Charlo was not ready for either time, is what it is. And it's a good thing that Jamal Charlo didn't sign off in that fight because Canelo would have completely embarrassed him.
Fighters that a lot of people wanted to see Canelo Alvarez fight before David Benavidez became a conversation were fighters that Canelo Alvarez never fought. I mean, 4 years ago, Canelo Alvarez versus Jamal Charlo would have been one of the biggest fights in the sport at that time.
Yes, and it was Jamal Charlo's fault as to why that fight did not happen. Golden Boy and Canelo stated that they sent an offer to Jamal Charlo, and Jamal Charlo, keep in mind that he's never retracted that statement, and I believe even at one point in time claimed that he turned that offer down.
A lot of people wanted to see Canelo Alvarez even fight Demetrius Andrade. They said what you want about Demetrius Andrade. That still would have been one of the biggest fights because
it definitely would have been. And that's the one fight that I think that Canelo around those weight classes said that I don't really want to get in the ring with that guy because he has a little bit of a challenging style. He uses a lot of foot movement that could give me a lot of potential problems. And on top of that, he's just way too risky for the potential reward. Like, he's not fought anybody. He doesn't have any name recognition. And then on top of that, if I get in the ring with some of these other guys like a Caleb Plant, I can get just as much credit for beating Caleb Plant. And then on top of that, overall, get just as much money. And to be honest with you, just my view, Caleb Plant is pretty much just as good as Demetrius Andrade. I don't really see what puts Demetrius Andrade above Caleb Plant. Demetrius Andrade might have a better counter jab over the top, but it's not really that much of a differential. But there's also certain things that Caleb Plant might be able to beat Andrade in. In terms of also not throwing as many wild and sloppy punches at times. And of course, he has a better resume slightly over Andrade because, no offense against Andrade, the man never fucking fought anybody, and I'm not, completely blaming that on him. That's not his complete fault, but to a certain degree it is because, he did not take certain opportunities when he should have. He could have signed with the PBC to possibly get the fight with Jamal Charlo and Jamal Charlo. He did not decide to do it. That's his fault. And Crawford had a very similar issue. But anyway. And of course, let's not forget when Demetrius Andrade ended up pulling out of the fight against Jamal Charlo because he thought that he was getting lowballed. But at the end of the day, it's like, dude, that would have done so much for your career had you fought Jamal Charlo. We could be looking at Andrade completely different had he actually won that fight against Jamal Charlo. And then on top of that, he would have got more big fights because more people would have put pressure on some of these other fighters for Andrade to fight him. But because he never fought anybody and he pulled out of that fight, no one really cares what fights Demetrius Andrade gets into.
Andrade and Jamal Charlo being in their physical prime. Canelo Alvarez himself was in his physical prime. All three fighters are the same age and they were in their physical primes. Those are the fighters that a lot of people wanted to see Canelo Alvarez fight, but he did not fight.
And once again, this narrative of Canelo Alvarez fighting guys that are not in their physical prime, all that is bullshit. Listen, there are about two guys that you can claim were not in their physical prime. What a lot of people tried to say is that Golovkin was not in his physical prime because he was about 36 years old. Keep in mind that Gennady Golovkin, this dude Demetrius Andrade, who was in his full-out prime, and a guy that apparently would have been so challenging for Canelo and all these other guys. Keep in mind that Demetrius Andrade had fought Ivanis Martirosyan many years ago. Now, to be fair, Martirosyan was a bit older here, but I don't think he was super old. Martirosyan still at this point had never been stopped at this point in time in his career. He had tough fights with Lara, tough fights with Andrade, tough fights with, I believe, the Charlo brothers, and Gennady Golovkin is the only one that made him look like absolute shit. Golovkin ended up teeing off on him within 2 rounds. So, once again, Golovkin was at his absolute peak. Yes, he was 36 years old, but he still was at the absolute peak as a fighter. Certain people can like that. They cannot like that. It is what it is. Once again, people love to use the thing about the age excuse. And sometimes the age thing is very valid. Like when you talk about, say Terence Crawford being 37, he's clearly slowing down a little bit. I don't think that that's a complete excuse. But you can't use it with every fighter because not every fighter ages the same, especially how long they've been fighting for. Like, for example, I said in my last video where I reviewed a video by the IBFP where I stated that Canelo really has more age on him than Crawford. And one of the commenters said that, what type of, bullshit are you trying to pull? Because Crawford is 3 years older than Canelo Alvarez. That doesn't make any sense. Right, but it's not always about how how old you are. Once again, you take a look at Beterbiev and Alexander Usyk, and they're 38, 39 years old right now, or 40 years old. And Artur Beterbiev is coming off the win over a Dimitri Bivol. And Usyk just got some of the biggest wins in his career at the heavyweight division with like 4 fights in a row. And the reason why they look at a better point in their career than both Canelo or Crawford is because they've not been fighting professionally for 20 years like what a Canelo Alvarez has. They've not been fighting 16 years like what a Terence Bud Crawford has, or 17 years. So once again, you can't always go off of age, because you have to take a look at how much wear and tear they have and how long they've been doing it for. Now, if you take a look at Crawford and Canelo, that makes a little bit of sense. Or Manny Pacquiao when he was starting to get older, sure. But when you talk about some of these fighters that especially come from the amateur program and then are within their mid, sometimes late 30s, they still are at a very great point in their career, and sometimes even in their prime, because, once again, they don't have the wear and tear that they had within, as much as other fighters. Like I said, Artur Beterbiev just got the biggest win of his career over Dimitri Bivol, someone who was an excellently talented fighter and someone that was younger than him. Now, the man that ended up trying to respond is that, well, Artur Beterbiev just ended up getting a knee injury, and Usyk, he ended up having some very tough fights at the heavyweight division, right? But if that's your best point, Artur Beterbiev, yes, he ended up getting a knee injury, but if someone is 39 years old and they clearly are aging very badly, and if they, are that bad to the point to where they're no longer near their physical prime anymore, a fighter is not even going to look anywhere near the same once they have a torn knee like that. They're not even going to be able to use that leg anywhere near to the same degree, at least if they're older or near the end of their physical prime. Like for those of you that remember Sergio Martinez, even though he did get into boxing quite late, by the time that he had fought Miguel Cotto, he had no knees left. He tore his knee against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. He was starting to age a little bit more as a fighter, and everyone just ages differently. His knees were done against Miguel Cotto. Once he tore that knee, he was never the same after his next 2 fights. His career pretty much was ended at that point in time. It is what it is. But when you talk about Beterbiev, he just got the biggest win of his career over that of a Dimitri Bivol. So bringing up the knee injury, you can bring that up all you want to, but I don't think that that's really a strong case about how Beterbiev is just super old and not at a great point in his career. And Usyk, of course, is having tough fights at the heavyweight division because Usyk is not a heavyweight. He's a cruiserweight. He's a guy that's 6'3" with a 7-8 inch arm reach, and he's fighting guys that are taller than him and bigger than him by 20 and 30 plus pounds. And on top of that, they're A-grade level champions. So I don't know really how that boosts your argument in terms of age. Of course, Usyk is going to have tougher fights with those guys because they're significantly bigger than him. Like, they're not just bigger than him by 10 or 10 pounds. They're bigger than him by 20 to 30 pounds. So once again, it's completely different.
He fought a lot of old fighters who are not in their physical prime.
No, he didn't. Once again, you can make the argument about Cotto and maybe Kovalev, who, by the way, still were champions and at A-grade level points in their career when he had fought them. And keep in mind, if you really want to debate someone who was quote-unquote completely out of their prime or someone that was really out of the way on the sport, we should start talking about Shawn Porter. Because Shawn Porter was no longer a champion. And Shawn Porter, he really had already lost a few fights at that point in time in his career and was no longer a champion. But you notice that the Terence Bud Crawford fans, that they won't mention that.
One of them he lost to.
And in my view, overall, that was an A-grade level win that Crawford had.
Mayweather Jr. One of them he got, Dimitri Bivol, that fight, in my opinion, a lot of people did not expect the outcome of that fight. Canelo Alvarez was just trying to add on to his legacy while claiming undisputed at one weight division while being a champion in another division. And I think he saw Dimitri Bivol as an easy pickings. A lot of people even thought Dimitri Bivol was a cherry pick. Some people were saying...
The people who thought that Dimitri Bivol was a cherry pick, all those guys were idiots. That just came from certain, once again, these pro-blackity-black channels like Dante's Boxing Nation and all these other guys. Anyone who knew anything about boxing that was actually paying attention, we all knew who Dimitri Bivol was. This guy always tries to put it in this perspective of saying that, Dimitri Bivol, he didn't really have a high amount of acclaim. Bullshit. Dimitri Bivol, everyone knew that he had a great amateur pedigree. And on top of that, both him and Beterbiev were looked at as the 2 best light heavyweight champions in the world. There wasn't another light heavyweight champion that was looked at as good as either Dimitri Bivol or Artur Beterbiev at that moment in time. So it is what it is. And on top of that, he had actually beaten some of the top contenders there, like John Pascal and Joe Smith Jr. and Sullivan Barrera. Unlike when Crawford had fought Madrimov, for example, and really fought nobody and only had a total of 12 total fights.
why isn't Canelo Alvarez going after the guy that many people think is a threat to him, which is Arthur Beterbiev? And so a lot of people were surprised with the performance that Dimitri Bivol had against Canelo Alvarez. Now we know.
I wasn't surprised, and a certain amount of other people who actually knew shit about boxing weren't surprised either. And Canelo was pretty much outboxed within that fight, but a big part of the reason why, once again, Canelo looked so bad within that fight is because I think that he thought that Dimitri Bivol, that fight was going to be similar to Caleb Plant. And then rewatching a little bit of that fight the other day, it was very obvious that Dimitri Bivol, that he was nowhere near as affected by Canelo Alvarez's power, nor his traps, nor overall some of his offense as some of the other fighters, because he was used to light heavyweight power. And that's why I say if Terence Bud Crawford, if he plans to gain weight for the Canelo Alvarez fight, that's the worst thing that he can possibly do. Because Canelo Alvarez is used to the type of power that Terence Bud Crawford is going to be trying to throw at him. In fact, he's been used to more. Canelo Alvarez is not really a natural light heavyweight, really, nor naturally a 168-pounder. But Canelo Alvarez is at least a claim to their size and their power. If Crawford once again gains weight for that fight, he's going to be losing every advantage to try to compete with Canelo in an area that he's not going to be able to beat him in anyway. So that's why I say Crawford needs to try to be at around 160 to 165 at most for that fight. But Canelo Alvarez, he tried to gain muscle mass for that fight because I think he thought that he could bully Bivol a little bit. And it was very obvious after the first few rounds that wasn't going to happen that way. And you could tell that Canelo, that he was fatigued. He was breathing deep and heavy even within the first 3 or 4 rounds. And Canelo Alvarez has never been a guy with elite level stamina. But he is a guy that eventually learned how to pace himself. But he looked even more tired within that fight because he tried to gain more weight and muscle mass for Dimitri Bivol in order to add his extra level of power. But in my view, Canelo Alvarez, in order to win that fight, he should have stayed at around the same size as a 168-pounder, in my personal view, at least if he would have had more of a chance. Because at least then he would have had more stamina, he would have been a little bit quicker, and he would have been a little bit more maneuverable. But Canelo, he looked slower, and on top of that, less maneuverable, and he had no stamina after the first 4 rounds. That's why he was up against the ropes so much within that fight. He had no stamina.
But before he fought Canelo Alvarez, a lot of people didn't even think Dimitri Bivol was for real. And so
No, that's not true. It's just like a lot of idiots like you that don't know shit about the light heavyweight division or didn't know shit about boxing, didn't know about that. Everyone who really knew about boxing in that division knew that Beterbiev and Bivol were huge threats, that they were the main 2 threats. So no, you're wrong, sir.
Found out, and Canelo also found out the hard way. And so most of the fighters that Canelo Alvarez beat that had name recognition were not in their physical primes.
Yes, they were. Gennady Golovkin was in his physical prime. Danny Jacobs was in his physical prime. Okay, when you talk about Austin Trout and Araceli Lara and Plant and Callum Smith and also Billy Joe Saunders, all those guys are in their physical prime. Jaime Munguia was in his physical prime. All right? Sergey Kovalev and Miguel Cotto, you can maybe debate that they were not in their absolute physical prime, but they were still A-grade level fighters at that time. Keep in mind that Kovalev was coming off of a great victory over Anthony Yarde and also Eleider Alvarez, 2 undefeated contenders for that weight class. And then, of course, now he did get knocked out not too long before that, but he got revenge against the fighter that knocked him out, and Eleider Alvarez. And then, of course, he also beat Anthony Yarde. Knocked him out, was the first one to beat a relatively talented and very athletic Anthony Yarde. That's the fighter that Canelo beat at the light heavyweight class. So it is what it is. And Miguel Cotto, once again, he was looked to be a little bit more refreshed and refurbished. So it's whatever.
Cotto, he was not.
What I'll state is this: the wins that Canelo Alvarez has over Sergey Kovalev and Miguel Cotto, they're about as good, if not even a little bit better than the Porter win that Crawford has, because Porter was not even a champion at that time, and he also was probably aging a little bit at that point in time in his career. And you can tell by in that fight that he was not really as motivated in that fight as what he was in the other fights because he was no longer a champion.
In his physical primes. Floyd Mayweather was not in his physical primes.
Bullshit. Yes, he was. Now, you can maybe state that Floyd Mayweather Jr., that he was not the same pretty boy Floyd. He was 36 years old, and keep in mind that was his 16th year of professional fighting, I believe. So he had a little bit, more wear and tear. But that was really the last, sharp performance in Floyd Mayweather's career, at least to the point of his peak. That was the last peak performance in Mayweather's career. After that, he still was a great athlete. He still was a great fighter, but he was starting to slip after the Canelo fight. That's why you had the Marcos Maidana fights to where they were very wear and tear on him. And even in the Pacquiao fight, you can tell that he's very fast there, but he's not really at his absolute peak anymore. You know, but this people try to state that Mayweather was like this old grandpa. No, that's not true.
Triple G, even in the first fight, I don't think Triple G was in his physical primes because
Yes, Triple G was in his physical primes. Yes, he was. He was knocking everybody out. Now, after the Canelo Alvarez rematch, that's when Gennady Triple G Golovkin started to leave his physical prime, and he clearly started to slow down. Yes, Golovkin was in his physical prime.
he was 34 years old. And so a lot of these fighters that had name recognition but were no longer in their physical primes are fighters that are right up Canelo Alvarez.
And like I said, I know I'm going to get some people on here that say, how can you say that they're in their physical prime? How can you say that they're in their physical prime at 36 years old? Like I said, is Alexander Usyk still not looked at as a guy that is a great fighter and debatably the number one pound for pound fighter? And he's going to be turning 38 years old, or he already turned 38 years old. Is Beterbiev not looked at as a great fighter right now and is 40 years old? Is he not top 5 pound for pound right now? If Artem Beterbiev is in a rematch with Dimitri Bivol, Bivol is 34 years old. He just turned 34 years old. Artem Beterbiev right now is 40 years old. Who do you favor in that match? Who do you favor in that match right now between Beterbiev and Bivol? And we all know that Bivol is looked to be in its physical prime. And on top of that, that Bivol is an all-around great fighter. So you don't have to state maybe that some of those fighters were at their absolute peak of the peak, but at the end of the day, they were either very near it or somewhat within their physical prime. Now, fighters that weren't necessarily within their physical prime, yeah, you can maybe say Kovalev and Cotto, but all the other fighters that Canelo Alvarez fought that would be considered as A grade, yes, they were in their physical prime.
Alley. Canelo Alvarez loved to fight those type of fighters. Meanwhile, Terence Crawford, on the other hand, has fought and beaten world-class fighters who didn't have name recognition in their physical primes.
Name the fighters that were world-class that didn't have name recognition other than Victor Postol. Or Israel Madrimov. Name the world-class fighters that Terence Bud Crawford has fought. I think that me and you have a different definition of world-class.
That's the difference. Okay, and so I'm not trying to, degrade Canelo Alvarez's accomplishment because he's actually a really good fighter. But however, he comes off as being a hypocrite because he doesn't really fight.
No, he doesn't come across as a hypocrite at all, at least if you know what you're talking about. He comes across as someone that that is telling the truth on Terence Bud Crawford's resume. To a degree anyways. I'm not going to go as extreme as what Canelo Alvarez said, but Terence Bud Crawford does not have a very expansive resume. It just is what it is. People can like it, they can not like that, but that's the truth.
Best fighters that are in their physical primes.
Let me ask you this. If Canelo Alvarez were to fight some undefeated European fighter that has never been a championship holder like an Aegis Kavalaskas, and people just said that, oh, well, he's a former Olympian. This guy just said that Dimitri Bivol was a guy that many people didn't know was for real. Right, but Jose Benavidez, Aegis Kavalaskas, Felix Diaz, and all those guys, no, those were the for real opponents that had great Olympic pedigrees. Like, get the fuck out of here.
Usually stays away from them, or if they're at a distance.
If Canelo Alvarez were to fight fighters like Aegis Kavalaskas and Hank Lundy and Felix Diaz and Jose Benavidez and Jeff Horn, people would be calling that a cherry pick. Like, come on.
Advantage, then he'll try to fight them. Just like when he was trying to fight Jamal Charlo. He actually fought Jamel when Jamel Charlo had to come up 2 weight classes to fight him, but he never fought Jamel when they were in the same weight class together.
Once again, many people love to use the size excuse for that fight. And listen, it's somewhat valid because Jamel Charlo was not accustomed to 168. I get it. But Canelo Alvarez is not a guy that's really a natural 168 pounder. What that fight is accustomed to, or what that fight is similar to, is when Floyd Mayweather Jr. fought Juan Manuel Marquez. Because they really were more similar in size than any of the real natural welterweights that have fought Floyd Mayweather. So if you're going to claim the size excuse or not give Canelo credit for Jamel Charlo, no problem. But Jamel Charlo was really a natural 160 pounder at the very least, and so is Canelo. Canelo really does not belong either at 175 nor 168. He's too small. It is what it is. He's a little bit girthier, but he's a guy that once again is about 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach. So once again, it all depends on your standards. I personally give Floyd Mayweather Jr. A grade level credit for beating Marquez. But if you don't, well, then I would understand the same narrative not the same narrative, but the same standards that you have for Canelo versus Charlo. But if you give Mayweather credit for beating Marquez in the fashion that he did, then you also should have the same thing for Canelo versus Charlo.
And so, Canelo Alvarez, he tends to fight fighters who are no longer in their physical primes, but do have name recognition. Terence Crawford, he had no choice but to fight fighters who did not have name recognition, but were also in their physical primes. And so,
yes, he fought a bunch of bums that were in their physical prime. Congratulations.
I think what Canelo Alvarez is simply doing is just trying to get under Terence Crawford's skin, and it's working because Terence Crawford.
And it does work because Terence Bud Crawford, you can tell, and this is why I say Crawford is taking this fight not to take a paycheck. He wants to beat someone like a Canelo because he realizes that if he were to end his career today, no one would really look at him like a Floyd Mayweather or some of these other fighters. Because people 20 years later on down the line are going to take a look at his resume and say, who the fuck did this guy face? Like, who is Aegis Kavalaskas? Who is Jose Benavidez? Who are these guys? You know, when people take a look at a Pacquiao or a Mayweather resume, people know about Barrera. They know about Morales. They know about Marquez. You know, they know about, certain guys like Miguel Cotto. They know about Ricky Hatton. They know about De La Hoya. They know those guys. Even when you take a look at Canelo's resume, they know about Golovkin. They know about Lara. They know about Jacobs. They know about Plant. They know about Charlo. They know about Kovalev. Even, Saunders, and Smith and some of those other guys to a degree. They know about Trout when he was, at least some of those guys, but especially guys like Golovkin and Jacobs and Lara and some other guys like that. When it comes to Crawford, the only two names that are really going to be massively remembered are going to be guys like Porter and Spence. Now, I do believe that Postol and Majimov and Gamboa also were A-grade level wins, but it is what it is.
Clap back immediately. And so,
and once again, there's a reason why Terence Bud Crawford claps back every single time someone mentions his resume. It's because he's very insecure about it. You'll notice that people usually only get very sensitive or try to defend themselves on repeat, usually when they're very insecure about something or when they realize that, there's a little bit of truth to that. Whenever someone usually gets sensitive to something, it's because they know that there's a little bit of truth behind that statement.
I don't know what Canelo Alvarez is talking about. I don't know.
Because you really don't know enough about boxing, sir. That's the reason why. Let me help you out.
What made him come on social media and trying to degrade Terence Crawford's resume, because he himself does have a great resume. His resume is filled with fighters that do have name recognition, but with just a little simple research, those fighters that do have name recognition that Canelo Alvarez actually beat were not in their physical primes.
Absolutely. Let's talk about a little bit of research. Let's talk about how Lara was a championship level fighter when Canelo had fought him and was in his early 30s. Let's talk about when he fought Austin Trout. Austin Trout was in his 20s, I believe. How both of them were in their 20s, and Austin Trout was coming off the win over Cotto. Let's talk about overall how when he fought Danny Jacobs. Danny Jacobs was 33 years old, became a two-time champion right after beating the undefeated Sergey Derevyanchenko. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how Billy Joe Saunders was in his early 30s. Let's talk about how Caleb Plant, I believe, was in his latter 20s or early 30s. Let's talk about how Gennady Golovkin, even though at 36 years old, was still knocking everybody out at the middleweight division, knocked out Ivanis Martirosyan, who had tough fights with Lara, Charlo, and also that of Demetrius Andrade. But Golovkin made him look like a bowling pin. Let's overall, talk about that. Let's talk about how he fought Jaime Munguia in his late 20s. Let's talk about some of the other opponents that Canelo Alvarez had fought either in their 20s or when they're a champion. And then when you talk about Crawford's resume in comparison, if we really want to go there, we could talk about how Porter was no longer a champion and already had suffered losses. We could talk about how Errol Spence was coming off of a 14-month layoff if we wanted to go there. We could talk about how Yuriorkis Gamboa did not belong at the 135-pound weight class and it was coming off of a year layoff. Is what it is. We could talk about how Majimov only had 12 total fights, no actual championship level experience against any fighter of name recognition or actual great talent. We could talk about all these things if we want to. I believe that Crawford has those 5 A-grade level wins, but once again, if we're going to go there, Crawford's resume leaves more to be desired, way more to be desired than Canelo's. And even if we want to go off this resume or this record of Canelo fought a lot of guys that were not in their physical prime, actually, when you want to go to it, you could actually debate more with Crawford, in my personal view, that he fought certain guys not exactly within their physical prime than what a Canelo Alvarez did. But anyway.
They were either old or on their ways out the sport. Fighters that were or are in their physical primes and who are world-class fighters are fighters that Canelo Alvarez do not want to fight, and one of them being David Benavidez. David Benavidez is a young, strong fighter who's in.
Now, I have criticized Canelo Alvarez for not trying to take that David Benavidez fight in the past, and I know that certain people have stated about the mandatory and stuff like that. Listen, if Canelo Alvarez really wanted to try to make that fight, he'd try a little bit harder to make that fight. It is very obvious that whenever Canelo was, whenever someone mentions David Benavidez' name, he gets very annoyed and he gets very pissed off about it. And when a fighter reacts like that, it's because they know that that fight would give them hell. It is what it is. I seen the same energy with Mikey Garcia several years ago when people would bring up Vasily Lomachenko around him, as well as Gervonta Tank Davis. Every time Lomachenko was brought up, either around Mikey Garcia or Gervonta Tank Davis, when he was getting #1 pound for pound acclaim, those two would always get very pissed off and annoyed. And they would always talk about how Lomachenko was getting more credit than what he actually deserved. Why was that? Because they were afraid that Lomachenko was going to get in the ring and whoop their ass. That's the reason why. Anyway.
Who's in his physical prime, who actually is known by the world, Canelo Alvarez has no intentions on fighting him.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for that video. But just to once again talk about their physical primes, the biggest wins in Canelo's career, of course, would be probably Lara and Golovkin and a few others, Cotto maybe, and, you know, Plant and Danny Jacobs and some other guys, you know. But once again, all the fighters, all the A-grade level fighters, just in my personal view, that are on Canelo's resume, at least when he fought them, I would say, once again, Austin Trout. When he fought him, at least. Of course, Trout didn't do much after that, but I would say at the time he was A-. Excuse me. And then after that, Araceli Lara, Gennady Golovkin, Miguel Cotto, Caleb Plant, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, Jamel Charlo, Jaime Munguia, and Sergey Kovalev. All those guys were either championship level or champions when Canelo had fought them. The problem is with Crawford's resume is that he only really has about 5 A-grade level wins, period. Because Jeff Horn is not an A-grade level win. I don't care what people say. I mean, unless you want to say that Canelo's win over William Skull, if he beats William Skull, is an A-grade level win. Now, you know, I understand that Jeff Horn has the win over Manny Pacquiao, but once again, Jeff Horn, for those of us who know what we're watching, he's a very one-dimensional fighter. He's a guy that, once again, is one of these guys that ends up beating a great fighter who either heavily underestimated them or perfectly countered their style. You know, like I said, like a Leon Spinks against Ali, like a James Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson. You know, so certain guys like that, it happens, you know, in certain times. Every generation has one of those fighters. A fighter that ended up winning a fight that they were not expected to, and then they were expected to do bigger things in their next fight, and they never did. You know, is what it is. But anyways, I just thought that I would talk about that. It was very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's pretty much about it. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later.